start again. My name is Lennart Maschmeyer. I'm a researcher at ETH Zurich, and I guess I'm a bit of an outlier here because I'm really an academic. I'm not on the practitioner side. And I had hoped that Silas Cutler, my co-author on this, would be here today because he's much closer to the work that most of you are doing, but I'll do my best standing in for him today. And just a disclaimer up front, this is really early work, so we don't have a draft yet. It's actually the most incomplete thing I've ever presented, so it's a risky thing to do. But on the other hand, it also means that any and all of the feedback we get from you today, we can still implement, and that's why I'm hoping, and I'm leaving some time at the end, at least planning to, for your questions and comments, and I'm really looking forward to them. So the bigger topic we have been exploring is the nature of APTs, and that way it fits very well to the talk we just had from Joshua and Alexis. As the key actors in cyber conflict, the process of generating knowledge about these actors, but also the limits of that process that already came out in the discussion now to some extent, and ultimately the implications for cyber conflict both on the research and practice side. So in a nutshell, the question we are exploring, I guess, is a deeper one. That's what can we actually know about APTs, and how do we know when we are right about this? And we focus on Sandworm as a use case, as a case study, because it's one of the most researched actors out there. So the starting point for this analysis is the way we see the key purpose of threat intelligence, which is ultimately about reducing uncertainty, similar to intelligence in general as an activity. And for example, design philosophy behind Lockheed Martin's cyber kill chain promises this increased predictability, and ultimately the goal is information superiority over adversaries, which basically would mean defenders always have the upper hand if they do it right. And more specifically, and again, correct me if this is wrong, threat intelligence aims to help clients achieve three main things for this overarching goal. The first one is obviously detection, facilitating detection and mitigation of threats. Then moving a step ahead, predicting threat types, building threat models, and ultimately also quantifying risks. And we had the talk about risk management, which was interesting to me because I had assumed this was already much more integrated than it seems to be the case. And finally, and this is the ideal case, right, of the information superiority, preventing or preempting intrusions. And the process of doing this, and I'm sure I don't need to explain this to any of you, so I'll just sum it up very briefly, involves really three relevant steps towards this construction of APT identities. So the first one is to gather samples and forensic data. And then this is the most relevant, interesting one. Then based on these samples, based on these technical artifacts, then drawing inferences about the actors involved, their location, right, attribution as we just heard, their intentions, skill level, organizational structure, and so on. And ultimately, and this at least most of the larger vendors are doing this, then building a catalog of APTs and their TTP. And also sometimes, some at least build then a taxonomy. Microsoft's new naming scheme is really interesting here because it contains both the motivation and the attribution, which allows you supposedly to know what you're looking at, but it also assumes a kind of static field, right? And it also leads to these colorful names like Seashell Blizzard and so on. I mean, we've all seen the memes about them, I'm sure. Obviously, there's a problem if any of this changes, though. And that leads me to the bigger problems here because, I mean, first of all, I think this is all great in principle. It's always easy to criticize. And all the data that comes from CTI reporting is fantastic for people like me who try to research this. But if we look at the process as a basically knowledge gathering, knowledge production process, it's fundamentally really fraught with uncertainty itself if we think about it. Because what APT identities are, it's really about reverse engineering these kind of actors from the technical artifacts we can see or observe, right, the more tangible things. So most of this process is really about drawing inferences from the technical evidence about motivation, objectives of these actors, their composition, the political role, and all of this has to happen through the subjective lens of the researchers that do this. This is fundamentally the way human cognition works, right? And also based on their own experience, their context, And as we know, most of these researchers, most of the people here too, I assume, are located in the West, and most of them actually in the United States and on the East Coast there. So ultimately what all this does is really putting a layer of subjective knowledge on top of these hard technical artifacts. And accordingly, and reflecting this subjective side, it's really interesting to see there are clear signs of myth building in this process, where APTs become similar to these mythological entities with mysterious powers, and there is kind of lore around them. Silas brought up this talk where someone said that they had found out that this threat actor must be left-handed, and it goes to this kind of detail. And I think CrowdStrike's comic villain APT bestiary is a really good example illustrating this kind of mythology around it. But the most basic, but also the most significant problem that I've already mentioned, that we've also already heard in the previous discussion, is that these actors continuously change. Attribution might also change as more evidence comes to light, and they might even split up, which is the case possibly with Sandworm. So all of that obviously brings problems if the idea is to build this catalog that allows you to predict the future based on what you can see, have seen, have observed about these actors. And why this uncertainty matters is because it informs, obviously, capability assessments and threat models, both by the private sector, also by governments. And all of this is based on observed past activity, the idea you can project into the future. And also, at least from what I read in the threat reports that are published, there is often in the background a assumption of somewhat linear kind of evolution of capabilities that just keep getting better, right? And it also matters because governments and firms, they allocate resources based on these assessments, so this can change real-world outcomes, obviously. And conversely, adversaries can exploit the flaws in this process, the uncertainty that it brings, for deception, and Sandworm has been quite adept at doing this. But in the most fundamental sense, and this then starts to interest me most as an academic here, threat actors are the primary agents, actors in cyber conflict. So what we know about these actors also means or determines what we know about cyber conflict as a field of activity in international politics. And to illustrate these challenges, limits of knowledge, but also this interesting evolution of this actor, we picked one of the most infamous, most well-researched APTs out there, Sandworm, also known as Telebots, Electrum, Kidak, Black Energy, Iridium, Hades, Voodoo Bear, and so on, depending on which vendor you trust most. And what we do is we track the evolution of this actor through known history, although right now we're only in 2018, so we're going to add on whatever is known now about the invasion of Ukraine, and building snapshots of the TTP during distinct phases of this evolution. And then examining the uncertainty that remains at each stage, and also interesting efforts to exploit that uncertainty by Sandworm. So the origins of this group are obviously in cybercrime, use of Black Energy 2, this cybercrime malware, and then which was probably first released in 2006, and then a transition towards targeting of political entities. So in this case, Ukrainian, Polish, and Georgian government entities. That comes out of that F-Secure report at the time. They're using phishing, backdoored apps. At that time are suspected to be Russian intelligence already, and their main tradecraft, which also gave them the name, is this use of Dune references. If I remember correctly, it was naming a bunch of C2 servers with names from the Dune books from Frank Herbert, but also using infrastructure as a Tor relay. And also at this time, which is interesting, they were exclusively doing intelligence collection, espionage, no active effects. And a significant change in the year after, so this basically remained relatively stable, at least the evolution from the use of cybercrime towards political targeting, but espionage. Then we see this significant change in 2015, adding on sabotage, active effects, adding on new tool here, kill disk, and also expanding the targeting from government organization to critical infrastructure in Ukraine and Poland, and also media organizations in Ukraine. It's that Starlight Media intrusion that probably most of you are familiar with too, trying to disrupt elections coverage there. And they stopped using backdoor apps for this, only relying on phishing at the time. It also becomes, it's hard to point out where the suspected Russian intelligence is no longer suspected until the kind of firm attribution But we decided that at this time there is an emerging consensus that this is really Russian intelligence behind it, also because of the targeting. Still, we see the Dune references in the tradecraft. There is not that much change. But then again, significant change if you think about the evolution of this actor, right, in 2016. So they added on a bunch of new tools here, Telebot, also using GCAD, commonly open source tool, but also Indestroyer as this tailored ICS malware, which is only at that time one of 4 that have previously existed, like Stuxnet. So a very significant evolution in the skills of this actor, right? Especially if you think about the origins in cybercrime. And this also starting to work at least on supply chain attacks rather than the basic phishing that they had been doing. And also not really a shift in targeting, more of a reduction where they're only going after Ukraine at the time because of obviously Russia's continued aggression against Ukraine at that time. So we have again the power grid sabotage in Ukraine 2016, but also the attack against Ukraine's Ministry of Finance that disrupted a lot of payments there and business tax transactions and so on, which really caused significant damage, probably much more than the power grid sabotage, even though the power grid sabotage got much more headlines. And again, with only 1 year, we again see a significant shift away from critical infrastructure sabotage. And the question is why? My answer would be that probably it didn't achieve the value that they wanted to achieve towards economic warfare, it would be known in covert operations, with NotPetya and also then the successor Bad Rabbit, as well as the predecessors Xdata and FileCoder, really trying to get these broad effects, mass effects through this self-spreading, apparently ransomware which turned out to be just data destruction. And an exclusive focus on sabotage, so they've abandoned entirely their intelligence collection at the time, at least based on the evidence that we have. And also have this, as I already said, fake ransomware and also apparent hacktivist tooling. NotPetya, though interestingly, also has some origins in cybercrime, right? But they repurposed it and apparently also made a few mistakes in repurposing it that actually prevented the decryption. So in a way, it connects to their roots, but also brings it into a very different realm than before. And yet again, a huge shift in the next year away from the targeting, or at least exclusive targeting of Ukraine, towards this Olympic destroyer campaign, which is interesting in many different ways. The first time they went after an international organization. And at that time also, and probably as a result of this international targeting, which is interesting if you think about the political ramifications here, finally the firm attribution towards Russia's intelligence agency, GRU. And another backdoor that they created, though, XRML, in the same year that came out of ESET reporting. So on the one hand, you have the focus away from Ukraine on the Olympic Committee, but on the other hand, the continued focus on Ukraine that again goes back to the very beginnings of the group, namely building a backdoor, although a more custom-made at this time rather than using a cybercrime one. And this backdoor is used for espionage. So also this means a return to the roots here. So if you compare this evolution, right, almost everything about this group has changed, but at the same time, you also have this curious kind of turn back to the roots with the phishing and targeting of Ukrainian government for espionage after this kind of adventurous experimentation with sabotage operations and disruption, still though with different tools, obviously. Considering these huge changes over time, then it's not surprising that there is considerable uncertainty about the identity of this group now. So ESET suggests, for example, that what was originally Sandworm, or Black Energy as they call it, has since split into at least 2 subgroups, Telebots and Grey Energy, with distinct tradecraft and targeting on each side. To me, as a researcher, it's interesting because ESET is actually one of the vendors that focuses mostly on the technical analysis rather than the political inferences and the strategic analysis. So from that background, it makes sense because we have seen this significant change on the technical end. It's also interesting because ESET notes in their report where they announced this shift that Grey Energy has stayed under the radar, focusing on espionage with many similarities to Black Energy. At the same time, telebots, the faction that was doing the disruption and sabotage, stopped activity after 2018. We only saw these sabotage acts again starting in 2022 with the invasion, right? And the question is why? Why did they stop? On the other hand, Kaspersky has suggested that the group behind Olympic Destroyer is yet another new distinct APT that they call Hades. And significantly, they reached that conclusion because of the differences they see in the tradecraft to previous Sandworm activity. So that example already highlights, right, that Olympic Destroyer is interesting because of these efforts we see from the actor, and it does seem to be Sandworm, to confuse threat intel researchers, planting false evidence, planting these false artifacts linked to other APTs. So currently, the earliest reporting on that incident by Intezer Group suggested it was 3 different Chinese APTs based primarily on these technical artifacts, which at the time obviously made sense. But then Cisco Talos also found overlaps with Lazarus, the North Korean group, but also then noted actually these could have been planted since all of these tools were publicly available. Kaspersky then finally picked up on these findings, agreed that these overlaps are likely a false flag, only then to go on and release that Hades report, where they note there are these overlaps with Sandworm, but, and this is where it gets really interesting, conclude that these overlaps are probably also intentional false flags. So even though there is clear overlaps with Sandworm, just by the experience of seeing this intentional misleading activity, they think this must be someone new, right? They know, highlighted it here in the report. They see it's a master in the use of false flags. That's why probably it must be something else. So ultimately, the linkage to Sandworm was only then confirmed in 2020 by a US DOJ indictment of these 6 Russian hackers involved, which put this case mostly to rest. So where does this leave us, right? What can we make of all of this evidence and the evolution? Does it mean that Black Energy Sandworm ultimately really just split up into these different groups, as it suggests? But if so, why did they do it, right? What is the reason behind this? What did they gain from it? What was the driving force behind it? What did they react to? And also then, why did the telebots arm, as I already mentioned, why did they cease activity for 4 years and only reappeared in 2022? And where this gets really interesting to me is because the whole starting point of this project was a conversation I had with Juan Andres at Sentinel-1 about the Fiasat operation, where he suggested that tooling there looked so schizophrenic, where one part was really advanced and the other part looked like it was just haphazardly thrown together, that he was not sure anymore which group was behind that, which arm of Sandworm. So that really started me thinking here. But another scenario than the split up could also be that the original Sandworm crew, Black Energy, known at the time there, just simply started scaling up over time and then experimenting with sabotage from 2015 to 2018, but only then started abandoning it again, right? So why put all this effort and then abandon the sabotage activity, sabotage operations, if you've built this skill? So considering that, maybe there is another scenario that makes more sense, that they got support from another team, another unit, maybe another institution that had more of this specialized skill and lent it to them for the time being. And here the Triton operation against Saudi Arabia is interesting because it suggests a blueprint for this, right? Where they worked with a specific research institute that got involved and provided the expertise needed to go after the specific petrochemical facility at the time. But there is still another scenario we could think of, and that's whether the activity that's generally attributed to Sandworm might simply be the result of, different specific configurations of different actors, different agencies within Russia's intelligence apparatus, government, and also criminal underworld and just hacker scene at a given moment in time. So as one researcher we interviewed for this project suggested to him it made most sense that maybe these are just different groups and they sometimes meet during lunch or cigarette breaks and they compare notes, and that's how some of these similarities come into play. And finally, what we also shouldn't dismiss, obviously, is all of this uncertainty and this kind of contradictory evidence and inferences about Sandworm. Is this just another intentional layer of deception, smoke and mirrors, to, on the one hand, maintain plausible deniability, but also obscure the political origins and goals of this group? Now, I don't know for certain, and I would also wager that none of us here really know for certain, because all of these scenarios, if you think about it, they are plausible. Although some of them obviously are more plausible than others, more supported by evidence than the others, and also by some of the technical evidence out there. But so the big point then is, right, if this is true for Sandworm, despite this wealth of evidence out there, that we ultimately don't know, is this the same group, has it changed, has it split up or not, where are they now? How much do we really know about the vast majority of threat actors out there where far less reporting exists? Now, some of the implications, and these are really preliminary. To me, in academia, one of the key implications is that most of these capability assessments, right, and you might have been unfortunate enough to have seen some of these cyber power indexes which try to map which country has how much power. These might be really way off because the international relations especially tends to conflate threat actors with, one country and one government. And at the same time, if these capability assessments, which also tend to assume that, capabilities just can't continue to get better, if these are wrong, that also means a lot of the inferences about the strategic dynamics involved, how cyber conflict is evolving, is wrong. And at the same time, if the attribution of a certain group to a specific government is wrong or is changing, the inferences about the political goals behind cyber operations that these actors conduct might also be wrong. On the practitioner side, and here again I look forward to your feedback, obviously on the one hand there is this risk of having a false sense of security. The 100% MITRE detection rate memes that went around recently, to me, were a good illustration of that, but also showing the awareness of this problem. But also the vulnerability towards deception that comes from basically the more you rely on and trust in this predictability of building catalogs, and especially the MITRE attack model, right, and the kill chain, they are really based on this idea, and here it goes a bit into the philosophy of science, that you can build a catalog of these models, of this activity, make it predictable, but ultimately this is human activity driven by intelligent and, I would hope, agents with free will that is not as predictable as physical phenomena. So if you fully trust in that, that ultimately might make you more vulnerable towards falling for the kind of deception that we have seen Sandworm use. So this is it from us. I've put our emails there. If you don't really feel like stepping up and commenting here, please do send us an email. And because, yeah, as I said, we really like to get some feedback at this stage, especially from this community. Thank you.
Any questions in the room for Lennart?
Thanks a lot for the presentation. I would like to ask, given the uncertainties, like all of these layers of uncertainties with the situation, and legal and diplomatic consequences, how appropriate is it for private industry to make these kind of attributions? And also another branching question is, how do states know how to handle these type of situations, given the do they really understand the uncertainties with these attributions? So that would be mine. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a great question. I don't claim that I have the answer for it. How appropriate is it for private actors to attribute this political activity? I think you're at the core, but for me it's a big unanswered question about this whole industry, because most of what CTI does is what intelligence agencies used to do. So for someone like me, I get insights into what used to be secret activity that you only find out 10, 20, 30 years after, usually when it gets declassified. So I think in a way it's great that we have this transparency from private actors. But yes, it has severe political consequences, especially if there's misattribution, right? So where sometimes I'm skeptical is that it's not always transparent how the attribution process works. So that's why I found the previous, I don't know where they're sitting, But Joshua and Alexis, the previous presentation was great because it shone some more light about how this process works. And I do think it's appropriate that private actors do this because they have all the data that's out there to attribute. They have more, at least they share the data that they have to some extent. And from that, it looks like they have more than governments. And yes, I think my simple answer to your second question is I don't see that governments are dealing with this very well for the same reason I kind of alluded to earlier, that it just seems to governments, policymakers seem to conflate whatever is, suspected to be maybe a state-sponsored actor with, okay, Russia has done this or Russia has done that. And also for this reason. So when I publish research, you get always these comments from people who are absolutely certain that some operation was for some specific goal, like the power grid disruption in Ukraine. Some Americans were convincing me that it's idiotic to assume that Ukraine was the target because obviously this was only a signaling exercise targeted at the US. Why would anyone care about Ukraine if the US is there, right? An incredibly arrogant thought. And I'm sure you've heard these kind of comments too, because that's the kind of frame of mind that most people, especially in the policy community in the US, see this. It's all deterrence and signaling. We're doing a little bit here. We're showing them our capabilities and then seeing what Russian actors, Russian-sponsored actors are doing through the same lens. And I think this is not only very misleading, but it's also potentially dangerous if it leads to some strategic answer that assumes this was the goal when something completely different might have been the goal.
Hi, just a suggestion, tying into the proof point presentation as well and yours. Could it be possible to explore these threat actors as institutions, right? So basically people that have a 9-to-5 job, they come into a building and do separate activities or different activities based on what they're instructed to do. So maybe this could be something that you can explore rather than looking at all the threat groups separately, but looking at these groups as potential institutions that operate based on some sort of instruction given a specific set of tooling. Someone does the initial phase and then it's taken by this group using a better tooling to do the persistent phase, and then it's taken by another one that does something else. So maybe this could be something that you can add and explore in this whole thing that you're working on. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's a great point. That would be the next step, right? We have this assumption of unitary actors, and we know they are not. They are part of institutions. Just to do any research about it, the problem is the same that I've just highlighted about this process. There is no tangible evidence that I could draw on that says that these are basically the rules, shared rules and practices of these institutions, which is the founding concept of an institution. We just don't know. There is not enough to grasp to know this. How many people work there, right? What is the organizational structure? You can draw some inferences. And I saw something great from the Dutch intelligence service in The Hague this year. Some of you might have been there, where they managed to piece together the organizational structure of Chinese intelligence units based on some numbering scheme they had used and that they had basically reverse engineered. So to me, that was fascinating. If there is more of this out there, I think, or the more of this kind of analysis there is, the more it becomes possible to do this kind of institutional analysis. Yeah, and I see a great prospect of getting a much better understanding about what we actually see from these actors out there. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. Maybe also a different, sorry.
It's very dark, yeah, it's very bright up here, and everything is very dark there.
Yeah. So maybe a different perspective from the private sector. So using MITRE, it's also about reducing complexity. I don't think it's all the idealistic, it's like perfect protectionism and determinism, but it's also to reduce complexity and focus on the assets and the tools and the environment you have as a private entity. So with also reducing uncertainty and complexity, it would also be interesting to see how you actually model this type of uncertainty? Because there are certain adversary costs with nation-state actors, like with humans, like learning a new programming language, how long that takes, how much it costs to buy in new developers, so to say, and integrate them into your social structure, institutional structure, and how you would model this as a research body. So how do you model uncertainty? Do you then have degrees of freedom of what these techniques could do, and then have Monte Carlo simulations, or so to say, that you see what are the possible ways how it evolves or develops over time in certain scenarios? Maybe that would be also an interesting concept, just as a thought.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, when you say, I mean, what comes to my mind is my other identity. I've really focused on the Sandworm activity against Ukraine, looking at the strategic value of cyber operations. And where I've landed on is building this model of the constraints that are faced by actors. I would assume in general that it become quite clear there, and these seem to be stable at least over the period I've looked at. And that, again, that's based on the technical evidence, because I don't know enough about, I first wanted to focus on individual operations, and I realized there's just not enough to look at, what are operational objectives, how many of them did they achieve, because it would be all based on inference. So the only tangible thing there is the bigger strategic goals that Russia had there. We know those relatively well, at least. And then looking to what extent each of these operations contributed towards these goals or not, and how the constraints that I identified there prevented them maybe from contributing more. That was so far the best solution I could find, but also it's not directly what you're getting at, because as an academic researcher, ultimately that's the big question for me, right? How does all this matter in international conflict? To what extent does it change anything about conflict or not? So those are the bigger questions that, are more interesting to me.
Okay, thank you, Lennart, for this talk. And then we're switching for the third talk in this session.
Thanks.